The bit of mathematics that I want to talk about starts, as all bits of mathematics should really, with a problem. And the problem has been with me ever since I was an undergraduate studying biology in the years immediately after the war. At that time, we were fascinated by the work of the ethologists Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen. And one thing that Lorenz wrote about was the way that animals behave when they fight. And he pointed out that very often they don't use their teeth or claws or whatever it may be to the full extent, but behave in a very conventional way, as if they were being careful always to hit above the belt and so on, and may even surrender in a very conventional way. Now, I don't doubt the facts. In fact, I shall give some examples of conventional fighting behavior later. What I doubted at that time, and still doubt, was the explanation that Lorenz gave for this behavior. What in effect he said was that animals behave conventionally instead of really fighting in an escalated way, because if they did use their teeth and claws, animals would get hurt, and that would be bad for the survival of the species. Now, even then, I knew that evolution doesn't actually work like that. You see, suppose there were two kinds of animal in the population, one of which did indeed bite, scratch, kick, hit below the belt and so on, the other one of which was very gentlemanly and only did very innocuous things. Who would win? Well, obviously the first kind, the kind that fought in an escalated way. Who would pass their genes on to the next generation? Well, again, obviously the first kind. And even if it was bad for the species, so what? So I knew there was a problem there, but I was busy with other things, like getting a degree and so on. And I didn't seriously think about this problem for another 20 years, when I found myself having a holiday in Chicago. And Chicago is an odious place. There's really nothing to do except work there. And I decided that I would think about this problem. And I decided to teach myself some game theory. All I knew about game theory was that it was a bit of mathematics that had been invented by the mathematician von Neumann for studying human conflicts, business conflicts in particular, economic conflicts. And it seemed to me it might possibly be useful for studying animal ones. So I learned a bit of game theory, not very much. I didn't need to learn very much, as a matter of fact. And I invented a game which seemed to me to illustrate the problem of conventional fighting. I imagined that there were just two things an animal could do in the course of a fight. One was indeed to fight in an escalated way, and the other one was to display. And I supposed that there were really only two kinds of animals, which I called hawks and doves. You must remember this was being invented in America during the Vietnam War. And hawks fight in an escalated way until either they win or until you're seriously injured and forced to retreat. A dove, on the other hand, displays the red breast or white wing bars or what have you. But if the other guy escalates, a dove runs away very quickly before he's hurt. And we imagine this population evolving. And we can ask, to what state will that population evolve? Well, it will evolve to something which is in this diagram called an ESS. That's short for evolutionarily stable strategy. Now, in words, an ESS is simply a strategy such that if all the members of the population are adopting it, no mutant strategy different from the ESS can come along and do better. And we can see how this works out. We can say, well, all right, what's the ESS of the hawk-dove game? Well, it obviously isn't hawk, oddly enough. If we were all playing hawk, we would be averaging -1 per contest. A dove who came along, he'd get nothing, which is bigger than -1. So dove mutants can invade a hawk population. But dove isn't an ESS either. If we were all playing dove, we'd get 1. A hawk mutant who came in would get 2. So hawks can invade a dove population, dove can invade a hawk population, and it turns out that the only ESS is to play sometimes hawk and sometimes dove. For those exact values, these values of V and C, it turns out that the ESS is to play them 50-50, but if those numbers were a bit different, then it would be some other probability.
I ought to mention at this stage, though I'll come back to it, that the thing that had brought this problem back to my mind was a curious manuscript by George Price. At that stage, all I knew was that about a year before I went to Chicago, I think, I'd been sent by Nature a manuscript by this person, George Price, I'd never heard of, on precisely this issue, arguing, correctly as I believe, that the reason animals do not escalate is that if they did, their opponent might retaliate and there'd be a nasty punch-up and they might get hurt. So the argument against attacking somebody is that he might hit back. And this was sent to me by Nature to referee. And the only problem was that it was 50 pages long. And I seem to have this fate of getting ideas from other people's manuscripts when I referee them, but I suppose it's unavoidable. Anyway, I wrote to Nature and said, look, I think this paper is really jolly interesting. Clearly you can't publish this, it's too long, but persuade the author to send you an abstract, which you can publish, and tell him that if he submits this to the Journal of Theoretical Biology, I feel pretty sure they'll publish it. But although George had argued this in a verbal way, he'd not made any kind of formal proof that this is what would happen. And I thought, well, what I'll do is to take this sort of notion of George Price's and see whether I can develop, using game theory, a mathematical model which will show that what he's suggesting actually works. And I went to Chicago. I spent 3 months there. The only thing you can say for Chicago is it's so awful. There's nothing to do there except work. I mean, it really is a frightful place to be. So I worked very hard for 3 months. And as a matter of fact, the problem turns out, once you think about it in the right terms, to be almost trivial. And at that stage, I thought, well, I suppose I'd better quote Price, because I mean, that's where the whole idea had started from. I searched through the pages of Nature and the indexes, and I didn't seem to have been published. And I couldn't find any record of it being published anywhere. And indeed, it hadn't been. And I had this problem of how do I get in touch with George Price and find out what happened to it. And in the end, I wrote to Nature and asked for his address. He turned out to be an unemployed American who had no formal training in biology at all, who had been working in computers, I think, and had come to live in England to do theoretical biology because that's what he wanted to do. And he decided that he could live longer in England on his savings than he could in America. And he was living all by himself in this pad in Charlotte Street. And I could go on talking about George for hours because he's a very strange character. But we did in the end agree that we would write a joint paper, which we did ultimately, in fact, publish. It took about 3 years. It's not published till, I think, 73, for various reasons. George was a perfectionist, and he wanted me to do more mathematics to show that some of the things he claimed were correct. And I had to teach myself some computer programming too, because it wasn't analytically soluble, and I had to solve some of it by computer simulation. But we did, in the end, publish it together in 73, both defining the conditions for something to be an ESS, showing that retaliation could stabilize ritualized fighting, and applying it to a number of other problems as well. But that was, I think, in a sense, the origin of the whole sort of game theory industry in biology as opposed to in economics. I should perhaps tell you a bit more about George.
George was one of the first, if not the first people, to really think about applying game theory to the problems of evolution. Now, I just wanted to people to understand that ever since then, there's been more and more interest in applying game theory to evolution. And it continues to be really at the cutting edge of our thinking.
Right. So George's 3 great contributions. One was to understand Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection. It was quite a technical thing, but very fundamental to the theory of evolution. The other was to apply game theory to evolution. And the third was his equation, the Price equation. There are 2 minds about the Price equation. There are people who look at the Price equation and think that it's the most brilliant way of looking at the dynamic of natural selection. And then there are those who think that it's a very beautiful equation, but you can't really do anything with it. And so there are 2 camps and 2 minds about the Price equation. When it comes to that famous 1973 paper applying game theory to animal behavior, everyone takes this to be the beginning of revolution in evolutionary thought, because ever since then, the idea that in order to understand the evolution of behavior, you have to understand the dynamics of an individual taking into account the choices of another individual, right? the application of that idea to the evolution of behavior at the population level has become central to evolutionary theory.
I think it'll be fairly obvious to you that the models, the hawk-dove game, the war of attrition game, the bourgeois strategy game, and so on, are a great deal simpler than anything that actually happens in the real world. But they do illustrate, I believe, that even very simple models, once you understand them, once you've got the logic of them, can actually be quite illuminating when you look at real animals.